All right. Hi, everybody who's coming in. My name is Patrick, and this is Kirsten Bailey. She is our escrow manager here at Stewart Title, and we are currently letting everybody in. Sorry again about our technical difficulties this morning. Our PowerPoint was giving us fits, but I think we are almost set and ready to go. We'll give it a couple more minutes as people join in. Today's class, assuming Kirsten is all right with it, we like to have dynamic classes. We like you guys to ask questions. So if you would like, you can unmute yourself in the middle of the presentation and say, hey, explain that a little bit more. Or we also have the chat option. So if you go down to the very bottom of your screen, you should see a little chat bubble. You can always write your question in there, and then we'll be able to address it as the situation comes up. So please feel free to ask questions. We want this to be a dynamic class for you guys. While we're waiting for people to get into the presentation, Kirsten, tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Well, hi everybody, good morning, and thank you so much for joining our Escrows on Easy Street presentation today. My name is Kirsten Bailey. I have been working in title and escrow for close to 20 years, and since then I've seen a lot of different types of transactions. We've seen a lot over that time frame. Handled everything from, residential refinance transactions, a lot of those in the last couple of years for sure. Residential resales, short sales, foreclosures, commercial transactions, and the like. So, and one of the main points that always is clear is that communication is a huge, huge key to ensuring the success of any one of those transactions. And so we will wait for people to come on in and join the meeting here. We'll give them a few more minutes, but the point of today is to just give you all some really great pointers on how to get your transactions off on the right foot to ensure success all the way through.
And just a couple footnotes for you guys too. This is the first of our Hot Topics classes that we're going to be doing once a month. So our next one is going to be on March 10th. So we will have plenty of information coming out about that. So be sure to check on our social media as well as any emails, and you guys will see the topic. It'll be same time, so 10 o'clock on March 10th, and it'll be a Zoom class just like this one. So we'll have that going. All right, well, we are 5 minutes in, so we're going to load up this PowerPoint, and we'll pass it over to Kirsten. Thank you guys for joining us on Escrow to Easy Street. So let's get this show on the road.
Okay.
All right, let's make sure. Everybody should be seeing a screen right now that says what to know about escrow. So if you're not seeing that screen, go ahead and write something in the chat. But if not, Kirsten, go ahead and take it away. Yep, I'm seeing some thumbs up so everybody can see our presentation.
Perfect.
It's all you.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you all again very much. So this presentation is going to be again, just some bullet points, some key points that you can take into any escrow transaction. And the point here is to be as proactive as possible. So that way, again, your transactions are getting off on the right foot. I can assure you, every single one of our escrow teams want to have successful transactions, and we want to make you look like rock stars when all is said and done. And so the more proactive you can be with your communication in the beginning of the transaction can just set that escrow up for success. So we'll go into our next slide here. When you represent a seller, there are some really key points of information that you can provide in the beginning that are really, really, really helpful. This very top one, seller contact info, I know that one kind of seems like a no-brainer. But you'd probably be surprised at how many times we receive a contract via email, and it's from a listing agent saying, hey, we're ready to open escrow, we've got an accepted offer, and there's no contact information. And oftentimes these properties have HOAs. We have to order HOA resale packages. As you know, time is of the essence. That's a hot button topic because that's a huge contingency within any contract. And we have to be able to contact your seller to provide those HOA links for payment so we can get that clock ticking. The HOA management companies will not start processing those resale packages or demands until payment is made. And so a point or a tip here would be when you do email over your executed contract, just take a second to supply your seller's contact information, phone numbers, email, current mailing addresses. It's really crucial for us to know if the seller is occupying the subject property or not. If there are tenants, then that's another situation that we would have to address. The other thing would be the listing side commission percentage. That's not disclosed in the contract the same way that a selling agent's commission percentage is disclosed. And of course, once we open escrow, we need to work up our figures right away, get estimated settlement statements out to a lender for disclosure purposes, and we try and be as accurate and thorough as possible at that point. And so along with the seller contact information, the listing side commission percentage information is really helpful. And then also any HOA and management company information, if you are aware of that. We can do some digging on our end, but oftentimes there are pockets of properties that have multiple HOAs. I'm sure we've probably all experienced that scenario where, you have 4 HOAs and maybe only 3 of them got ordered. And so the more proactive you can be with providing that information up front, the more we can just have all of that right out of the gate and just get going on it immediately. With the seller information, there are a multitude of circumstances that can create hurdles throughout any transaction. Oftentimes you've got a situation where you have multiple sellers, but you just want one point of contact who's going to be managing the transaction on behalf of the sellers. So that's good information to have. Maybe your seller acquired title as a single person, but that person is now married. And with Nevada being a community property state, we have to address things like that. So if you know that your seller has gotten married since acquiring title to the property, that's information that we would need to have. On the flip side of that, if you have a situation where you've got 2 sellers in title who were married at the time but that are now divorced, that's also really crucial information for us to have. Or maybe they're not officially divorced, but they're going through a divorce. I mean, there are so many circumstances that could create a lot of hurdles at the end if we're not given that information up front. Oftentimes surrounding those circumstances, there's a lot of documentation that we have to review, have approved by our title department, in some cases our underwriters, and that stuff just takes time. So the sooner we can get our eyes on that in a transaction, the better off we're all going to be. Death is another circumstance that we really need to be made aware of. If you have a situation where you've got maybe 2 people on title, but one of them has passed away, depending on how they hold title could determine whether or not a probate action is needed for us to be able to move forward with our transaction and close, which of course means a lot of extra time, in some cases a lot of extra money too. So again, that's all information that we would really need up front so we could start that process with our underwriters and the court if necessary, if a probate action is necessary. Bankruptcy is another scenario that, again, if you know that your seller has just, signed papers to go and list their property, and then their next appointment was with a bankruptcy attorney to go and file bankruptcy, please let us know that. Bankruptcies will stop a transaction dead in their tracks. And again, that's another circumstance where we would need to require court approval before we could move forward and close. Power of attorneys, that's another scenario that is always best to discuss up front. The reason being is that power of attorneys have to be approved by us. They're heavily scrutinized by our title department, by our underwriters. We need to know things like, why is the power of attorney being used? Was the person incapacitated at the time they signed it? Hopefully not. But we have so many questions, and there are different types of power of attorneys that would be utilized in different situations. We, of course, always prefer that the power of attorney be one that we prepare. It would then be a transaction-specific power of attorney. And when it's done in-house, then we know that we're hitting all of our key points and things that we would need to make sure were in place before we could close a transaction. But if you have a situation where maybe a seller has left the country because they're in the military and they're now being stationed somewhere outside of the US and they've appointed somebody as their attorney. In fact, I mean, those are common scenarios. But again, we just have to take the time to review the documents and make sure that the proper approvals are in place before we can proceed with closing. The leaving the country scenario, that's sometimes is along the lines of the power of attorney, but not always. We can certainly accommodate transactions where we have principals outside of the country. But again, that just takes some additional coordinating for people to be able to sign documents outside of the US. They typically would need to do that at the US Embassy or the US Consulate. And right now, under COVID and all of those circumstances, I know those timelines are way further pushed out than they used to be. But prior to COVID, in some places, it would take several weeks to land an appointment at the US Embassy for notarization services. And so that is a situation where having that information up front would be really, really crucial because it can drastically push back the timeline of any transaction. The mobile notary scenario is another situation. We don't always know that information up front, but if you know that your seller has since maybe relocated out of state and they're no longer living in the property and they're not going to be coming back to Reno prior to closing to sign documents, then we're in a situation where we're going to need to schedule a mobile notary. And due to our current COVID climate, mobile notaries, you can't schedule them within a matter of hours like we used to in the good old days. Some of them are several days out, and so that's always good information to have up front. If you are aware that your seller has no social security number, that's another situation that would need to be addressed in the very beginning. I know there's a section now in the residential offer and acceptance where your seller has to declare whether or not they would be subject to FIRPTA withholding. But again, if you have information relating to that, just come right out with it, right in the beginning. Just say, hey, my seller, they're foreign people and we're gonna need to deal with the FIRPTA aspect of all of that. The other thing too is if you have knowledge that they're delinquent on their mortgage or their homeowners association dues, that's definitely good information to have. Oftentimes when we're requesting payoffs, that would be done through a completely separate department or sometimes an entity. If the loan is in default and it's starting to go through the foreclosure process actively, we oftentimes have to go to the attorney's office that is handling that foreclosure and obtain the payoff from them. And of course, with any circumstance like that, there's a lot of additional time that's necessary. Sometimes it can take weeks to get a payoff out of an office like that when it's a foreclosure scenario. So if you have information that they're delinquent or maybe they are in forbearance on their loan, we've experienced a lot of payoffs where they were in a forbearance situation due to the COVID circumstances. That's really good information that we would need to have up front, because then we know that our timelines are going to be extended. We'll know to ask the right questions and get to the right departments right off the bat versus just submitting our normal requests to our normal department only to have to follow up multiple times and then sit on hold for hours and hours to be routed to multiple departments to find out that information. Same thing with the HOA delinquencies. When HOAs are in a delinquent status, those HOA companies turn those over to collection companies, and oftentimes those are attorneys' offices. And we have to obtain our demands from the attorney's office and not the HOA company. So again, they have additional requirements. They have additional authorization forms that need to be completed before they'll release any information to us. So those are all just good information, pieces of information to have before we get started on processing our file. If our seller is an entity, if they're an LLC, if they're a corporation, partnership, we have to review the entity documents for that entity. And the reason being is that we as the title company have to verify that, the person signing on behalf of the entity has authority to do so and has the authority to act on behalf of that particular entity. And so it's always best to get that information submitted up front because, again, it needs to be reviewed and approved by our title department. In some cases, it needs to be reviewed by our underwriting department. And nobody likes that scenario where, that documentation is not submitted until the last minute and then we miss our closing date because there are then additional requirements put in place due to what might be contained in those entity documents. Same thing with the trust. If the seller is a trust, we need to review that documentation as well. Oftentimes if it's John and Jane Smith, trustees of the John and Jane Smith Trust, it's a pretty simple review process. But when you have a scenario perhaps where it's John and Jane Smith, trustee of the John and Jane Smith Trust, and maybe Jane has now passed away, there's more documentation that we would then need to review before we would be in a position to move forward and close. We would, of course, need Jane's death certificate. And a lot of times with a trust scenario, there are very specific instructions with what needs to happen and how that trust needs to handle a transaction. Sometimes upon the death of a trustee, it doesn't just get left to the other trustee. Sometimes there are then co-trustees that are brought in and they have to take part in executing documents too. And we don't know that until we see that documentation. So it's crucial that we have it so we can prepare our documents properly and then of course ensure that we've got the authorized parties preparing or signing that documentation. If you have knowledge that your seller is wanting to complete a 1031 tax-deferred exchange upon the sale of this transaction, that's really, really important information for us to have as well. We have to coordinate with the exchange company in that instance. They have documents that they have to prepare and send for all parties to sign. It makes a difference with how we prepare our documents as well. I had a transaction, this is just a quick story, but I had a transaction where nobody informed me that the seller was doing a 1031 exchange. The seller didn't say anything, the agents didn't say anything, and here I am, 4 o'clock on a Wednesday, and we're closing the next day. The seller's in the office signing on Wednesday at 4, and we talk about the disbursement of proceeds form. And he says, well, shouldn't we be sending the money to the exchange company? And I said, wait a minute, back up. There's an exchange company? He said, yeah, I was thinking about doing an exchange and I really want to do that. And so how do I go about that? And I said, okay, well, let's first of all, who are you wanting to go through for your exchange? And he didn't know who he wanted to utilize for the exchange, the exchange. And so after just some discussion and some quick decision making, because we needed to get that documentation in prior to closing the transaction, luckily, we were able to contact his exchange company of choice. They were awesome. They were able to generate documents quickly. Though I was in a position where I had to redo a lot of documents and have a lot of things re-signed by everybody, we were still able to move forward and close the transaction the following day, but it became a fire drill. And, not necessarily one that was enjoyed by all parties because we needed to get stuff in place before we could actually close the transaction. So that's all good information to have at the very, very beginning of each and every transaction. At the end of the day, we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what things could come up in a transaction, but these are some things that could definitely create some hurdles that don't necessarily need to if we can have this information up front and have the opportunity to review things in the beginning. We have a question. Let's just take a look here. How is a transaction different when one spouse is from here and the other is here on a fiance visa or green card? Tiffany, I have not encountered something like that specifically. It may be a situation where partial FRIPTA withholding might be required. Sylvia, are you still in here? Sylvia, and I don't know if she knows the answer to that question. Sorry guys, I'm just taking a peek to see if I've got someone in here that might have encountered something like that. I haven't personally. And Tiffany, okay. Sylvia, the question is, how would a transaction be handled when maybe you have sellers of a property, one of them is from here, so US citizen, but the other is on a fiance visa or a green card?
Hi all. So sorry, I was trying to listen to the gov at the same time. I was multitasking.
Yeah, that's what we do in escrow.
Yeah, so really there is no difference as long as they have the green card. Obviously for notarization, we would need to have the same, they have to have the photo ID, passport, whichever way, but they're not, as long as they're a resident alien or have the green card, they are considered a citizen. Now, when they go to sell, as long as they have the current resident alien status, then we don't have to worry about FERPTA. But coming into a transaction as a buyer, they're fine. If there were two spouses and one was not a resident alien, they're a foreign citizen, then their half would then be subject to FERPTA, which basically is a whole nother class.
Yeah, exactly. We do need to do a class on FERPTA, and we've had many, many requests for that. So that's definitely coming.
Any other questions concerning sellers before we move on to the buyer side of the transaction? And again, feel free to use chat. You can always unmute yourself. All right. Well,
how do you
done.
spell FERPTA so I can look it up on my own time?
I'm sorry?
How do you spell that word? What was it? FERPTA?
Oh, FERPTA. So it's F like Frank, I, R, P like Paul, T like Tom, A. And that is an acronym for the Foreign Investment Real Property Tax Act.
Thank you. I'm going to go look that up.
Of course. Okay, let's go on to our buyer information slide. So a lot of the things when representing a buyer, you're going to see some crossover here because there's a lot of just, again, communication and things that when you have pieces of information that we would need to know to complete a transaction. Again, the more you have up front, the more you provide up front, the better off we are from the get-go. When you go to open an escrow, of course, earnest money, that's a key piece to that. That's where the contact information is crucial as well. Oftentimes buyers are now wiring earnest money deposits, which is great. It's nice, it's convenient, assuming they're getting wire instructions via a secured method, but we can't do that. We can't get them wire instructions via a secured method if we don't have their contact information. And again, it's crazy how many transactions are sent over without any contact information whatsoever. Time is of the essence with each and every one of these transactions. Earnest money is really that first thing to kind of kick it off. And I've had so many instances where a contract is emailed over with instructions to send wire instructions to the buyer so they can wire their earnest money, but I have no contact information. So again, just take the couple of extra minutes when you're sending over that contract to provide all the contact information up front for your buyer and your lender if there's a lender involved, which a lot of times there are. Of course, it's important that we have the fully executed contract together with any applicable counteroffers and addenda that may be in place at that time. So again, with buyer circumstances, again, a lot of these are crossover from what we've discussed with the seller circumstances. If there's a main point of contact that wishes to be the person involved and kind of managing the transaction, let us know that up front so we're not bothering any other parties. You know, if your buyer is a married person but they're the only person on the contract. They're going to be solely purchasing in their name. Again, due to Nevada's community property laws, that needs to be addressed before we would be in a position to close, and that buyer's spouse would then need to be able to execute a spousal deed before we could close. Sometimes that takes just additional coordination. Maybe that spouse isn't here, you know, so there's, again, that's all good information to have, the marital status of the buyer upon opening an escrow. Same thing with the divorce. You know, if the buyer is already officially a divorced person, then they're just unmarried and we don't have anything to worry about there. But if they're actively going through a divorce at the time that they're purchasing this property, even if they have a filed legal separation document, they're still legally married in the eyes of the state of Nevada. And we would then have to deal with those community property circumstances. Bankruptcy, power of attorney, I mean, it's the same thing as what we discussed with the seller circumstances. I mean, that information just really needs to be provided up front because there's additional review times involved. We have to go through our title department, sometimes our underwriting department, and that stuff just doesn't happen overnight. If they're leaving the country, again, same reasons as with on the seller side, you know, it just takes some additional coordination. And it doesn't happen overnight. We just have to have as much wiggle room and as much of a heads up on all of those things as possible. Mobile notary, same scenario. We don't always know up front, but the more lead time we have on acquiring a mobile notary and getting all of that scheduled, the better chances we have of closing the transaction on time, which is what we all want to do. If the buyer's a trust or a business, same thing, we're going to need those same entity documents for review purposes as we would on the seller side of a transaction. Those tell us how our documents need to be prepared. Those documents tell us who needs to sign on behalf of that trust or that entity. You know, if you've got a buyer who wants to purchase in the name of their trust and they're also getting a loan, the lender's going to need that information as well. Again, so that their documents can be prepared properly and we can make sure we've got all the proper signing authority, so on and so forth. And then the same thing with the 1031 exchange. I mean, if on the buy side, we've got a buyer who's completing a 1031 exchange, well, the exchange accommodator, you know, their money, or at least a portion of their money, is going to be coming from them. But again, there are documents that need to be prepared. The exchange company needs to coordinate with us on those so that they can prepare their documents. And the earlier on in a transaction we can get that done, we can get those documents out for everybody to sign, we can get all of that stuff just laid down, the foundation, so that way we have our best chances at closing that transaction on time and successfully. I don't have to spend as much time because I think I went into the reasons really behind providing that information or that documentation up front as to why it's so important in the beginning of a transaction. So at this point, I can open it up to questions. Does anybody have any questions? I know sometimes these types of discussions lead into additional things like the FERPTA. We'll do another class on FERPTA. As I said, that's been requested multiple times. It's you know, not something that we come across too frequently here in our area, but it is something that we do see occasionally. And so it's important to know how to move forward under those circumstances when FERPTA would be in place.
I'm looking forward to the FERPTA class. I have a friend here.
We've had a lot of requests for that. It's important, and it's something that, like I said, most of us don't see it very often, especially in our area. So
yeah, I have a friend that's actually moving here, and she's engaged to my other friend, so that's why I asked that question.
Okay, but she is a resident alien?
No, she's still in Canada. She's still in the interview.
Okay, I gotcha.
Yeah,
so you're just trying to be proactive about it. I love that.
Yes, trying, but they're moving to Oregon, but still they trust me, and I need to have for them if just in case they do ask.
Well, and as Sylvia said, I mean, on the buying side, you're not going to encounter any of that. But on the selling side, if they're not a U.S. citizen or a resident alien with a green card, then that's where the FERPTA stuff could apply. So,
thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And like Kirsten mentioned too, the more information you guys can supply to us in the beginning, the better. We have an escrow officer here who her clients had told her, the realtor said, well, the son is on the title, but the son is dead. And it wasn't until the very end of the transaction, we couldn't find a death certificate, anything like that. And the realtor called and said, I messed up. I didn't hear what the wife was saying, or the mother was saying properly. She said the son is dead to me. And so then come to find out 2 days before closing, the son is not actually deceased, just there was a family falling out, and therefore we still need the son to sign off on the title. But again, not the realtor's fault, but just the more information you're able to share with us, the easier the escrow will be from the very beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. We're just taking a peek here at the chat bar. We've got a couple more questions coming in. If a seller had died without a will, how long does the probate process take? That's a good question. You know, probate's a funny situation. There are different types of probate. Some take a little longer. If you know, the estate is really, really involved, it could take a long time. If there are a lot of heirs, you know, sometimes they get pretty messy and pretty hairy. But, you know, in a general sense, once probate starts, you're probably, and I don't know, Bill, you're in here, so feel free to chime in on this, but, you know, from the point probate is open to the point you can actually get a court date and a court hearing to get an order confirming sale or an order to distribute the estate, I mean, you're probably looking at a minimum of, I don't know, 60 to 90 days, would you say, Bill?
At least.
Yep. Yep, and again, that could be extended due to different circumstances. If it's a big estate with a lot of assets, then there's a lot to get through. But if it's, you know, minimal, there, again, like I said, there are different types of probates. You could do a set-aside probate. And, you know, that's when the value of estate is under a certain amount. In which case it's kind of, I don't know, I refer to it as like a mini probate because there's just not as much and you can get an order fairly quickly. So Chrissy, I hope that answers your questions. I wish, I wish it was more cut and dry and I had, you know, specific timelines, but it's really case by case on the probate scenario. Just checking out a couple more questions in the chat bar here. Oh, this is a good one actually, and this did come up. I had touched on it briefly on the buyer circumstances and why it is so important to be provided with buyers' contact information. You know, but we as Stewart Title, we partner with a company called Certified to securely send and verify wire instructions. And we do that by sending directly to your buyer, of course, in the case of where we would be sending wire instructions so that a buyer could send in an earnest money deposit. We send that via Certified. It's an amazing company because they guarantee wire transfers up to $1 million. So it gives everybody that peace of mind that, you know, the money's going to get to where it needs to go. And if for some reason it doesn't, there's a guarantee in place where that buyer's funds are protected up to $1 million, as I said. But for us to be able to send those wire instructions securely, we do need a valid email address and a phone number to be able to send those wire instructions and allow the buyer to go through the authentication process to ultimately download our wire instructions. So that's something that, again, when you're sending over the contract via email, just take a couple of minutes extra to plug in all the valid contact information so we can just get those out right away. Let's see, just to add to the FERPTA comments, if your buyers are getting a new loan, you would want to check with the lender to see what their requirements may be for a foreign buyer. Yes, absolutely. That's a great point, Sylvia. That's something that, of course, would need to be addressed on the lending side of things as well. Do we have any other questions that we can address? I don't see any more in the chat bar here, but again, feel free to unmute yourselves and pipe up. Okay. Well, I think you are still seeing the screen here. There's just some additional questions, and these are good questions for you to be able to ask to your clients when you're, you know, taking your listing or going through the process of writing your offer. just so you can know what information you can relay to your escrow team. One of the things actually here that I didn't touch on earlier is their construction in progress, recently completed or unfinished. And you know, typically if you're selling just a stick-built home that's been there, you know, that's not something that you generally would have to worry about. I mean, if the owner of the property has recently hired a contractor to do a complete remodel, then yes, we would need to know that. But you know, if you're aware of any type of construction or work that's being done in the property, definitely let us know. That brings up some mechanics lien issues and certain things that require additional layers of approval, even more documentation, and I think perhaps a mechanics lien construction financing type class would also be a great one to get on the books, because there definitely are additional requirements that would need to be met in those circumstances. The other one too is the mobile home. If there's a manufactured home on the subject property, you know, we have additional documentation that we would need to acquire and prepare in those circumstances. And there's different circumstances. I mean, maybe the mobile home's already been converted to real property. Sometimes people think it's been converted to real property when in all actuality it hasn't. And there are additional steps that would then need to be taken to complete a conversion. Sometimes we have to involve a previous title company that was maybe involved in initiating the conversion. And again, those are all things that would take some additional time and documentation. If the property is not converted, and doesn't intend to be converted. Again, that's stuff that we can handle through escrow as far as getting it transferred, but requires some additional documentation and information to be supplied. And then we touched on the non-resident alien and the requirement for FIRPTA in that case. So, do we have any other questions? My contact information is listed, so please take a snapshot of that. I'm always available. I love to be a resource. I love to educate, and you know, even if you've got a question that maybe we don't have, maybe we don't have the escrow here at Stewart Title, but you just want to run something by any of us, we're all here and available, and definitely want to be a resource to all of you. So. With that, I'll say thank you so much for your time today, and please reach out if there's anything we can do for you, any questions you may have.
And this class today was recorded, so we'll be able to send a recording to all of you guys. We'll also be able to include the slides. That way you guys just have it for reference for any future escrows. Thank you again to Sylvia. She is the president of our company. She was on here. Bill Bernard is also on here. He's one of our chief title officers. And Kirsten, thank you again. She's our escrow manager.
Thank you.
We've got 8 different offices spread out around the area, 3 here in Reno. So to make sure you got an escrow on Easy Street, just remember the keys that we gave you and reach out to one of our escrow officers. Thank you guys again for being here today. We look forward to seeing you guys on our March 10th class, which sounds like we might be doing FIRPTA or mechanics liens or something, another hot topic that might be important. So thank you guys again for joining us.
Thank you.
And have a great day.